Well, welcome back. I say that because I've had to split the video in two. We had fire inspectors come right at that point and checking fire alarms and the gas fireplace behind me. So I've had to take a break and finish with the rest of our story. So we're going to look at the garden in a little bit more detail. And the first thing in the garden that I think everybody notices is, or is focused on because it's so unusual, is the pillar. And in the diagram, the pillar in the garden sits at the exact point where the confessional would sit now in the church, which places it in the church landscape between the devil statue and the John the Baptist and the Jesus statue. So it's kind of like a balancing point between the two. And it is very strange because you can see a picture here of Sauniere with it back originally from his postcard series. It's a statue of the Virgin Mary. It has the words penitence, penitence across it. And you can see he's taken what is the original statue or the original pillar that was beside the original altar in the church, but he's placed it upside down. So the cross is upside down at the bottom, and we have the words which are supposed to be Mission 1891. So we're going to go into a bit of this statue and of this pillar in detail and try to determine what this might be telling us. So penitence, penitence is supposedly the words that were said by the young Calvary girl, the one who was probably linked to Emma Calvary, who had the vision of the Virgin Mary, and these are two of the words that were said to her. So it's also quite interesting that Sauniere has those words specifically on the pillar. But what we're looking at is this was placed in the garden on June 21, 1891. And first Sauniere had a procession through the village with this statue, which is the Virgin of Lourdes, which is really interesting because he took 24 children, I believe. He had 24 children who were getting their first communion, and he had a number, I think it was four. Four people carried the statue all the way around the village. And then it was placed on this specific spot. The importance of the procession and the date shouldn't be underestimated because that, of course, June 21 is the summer solstice. And 1891 is the year that Gerard de Sade says in his book that the treasure hunt starts. When you notice that he's inscribed, now I'm going to show you here. Here's a picture of the statue today. So this is what it looks like today, but the bottom pillar that you're looking at, that is a reproduction. The original is in the museum. Here's a picture of the original in the museum. So you can see when we go back, if I show you the original again, they haven't made it exactly the same. They've changed the pillar in the reproduction. And again, like everything in the story, why would you have the stone? It's not like it's lost. It's not like you have to make it from your memory or something. You have it. You're putting it in a museum. Why wouldn't you just make it exactly the same? It's not exactly the same. Anyway, we're going to work with the original pillar because that's the story that goes on here. So he's inscribed the words Mission 1891. So the first question is, what mission is he describing? And is it a mission that is beginning in 1891 or ending in 1891? The place where the Virgin Mary is, she would be seen by everyone approaching the church first. So the first thing you'd see on walking to the church would be this statue, and the first thing on entering the church you'll now see is the devil statue. So again, this very interesting mirroring that's constantly going on, like I said, between the garden and the church, and now even the statues that are placed in the church. So you have this, again, this balance of good and evil. So the first communion of the 24 children of the parish was, quote, to bring to a close the spiritual exercises of the retreat that had been preached by the Reverend Father Farafat, diocesan missionary of the family of Saint Vincent de Paul, residing at Notre Dame de Marseille. And at Notre Dame de Martial, which we'll look at in the next video, which is in Lemieux, it's dedicated to the Black Madonna. So keep that in mind. Now the 1891 itself is become a puzzle, because once it's turned upside down, you have to wonder, is the year 1891 the year that's being referred to, or because it and the cross is upside down, the number is meant to be read 1681. Now, specifically in our story, we don't have a date 1681 specifically for that year. Now, of course, that's right around the time just after Poussin has ended his painting, that we've had the breakup of the Sacrament Society. We've had the building of St. Sulpice. So we've had lots of things happening in that period of time, but nothing linking to that date. But we do remember in the parchment, supposedly, is this term Pax 681. And so is 681, we're somehow referring to the 1681 that Sauniere wants on this pillar. Another way you can look at the word mission is, of course, it has the word Isis in the middle of it. So this was interesting to me, because you have M, Isis, On. And On, of course, is the name of the original city of Heliopolis in ancient Egyptian, the place of the great pillar and the Ben stone. I'm just throwing that out as a outside strange possibility. When we come to the number 1891, though, and we look at it a bit more closely, first we notice that the 8 is not an actual 8. I don't know if you can see it really well in the clip here, but it's actually two small, it's the two non-touching O's that make it look more like a colon rather than an actual 8. And for here it was George Sherrill who claims he understood the meaning of this 1681, but he claims that he first looked for the only place the word mission occurs in the New Testament. It's actually only once, in Acts 12:25, on the final page of chapter 12, and Barnabas and Saul, returning from Jerusalem, have fulfilled their ministry, taking with them John, who was surnamed Mark. So what he did is he then, by thinking of it as a colon and not as an actual number, he looked at it as being possibly 16.1. And his thinking was, okay, if I took the last word of that, the last thing mentioned in what I just read, which would be Mark. So if he looks to Mark 16.1, which is a small set of passages that actually run 1 to 8. That was claimed to be the original ending piece of the book of Mark, and everything that comes after that is considered to be added much later. So the original text is only Mark 16, 1 to 8, and it is this. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, who will roll the stone away from the entrance to the tomb? But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Do not be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus of Nazarene, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. So if this theory is correct of what this marker might mean, then we have a discussion referring to the rolling of the stone away and the rising of Jesus. We have 3 women mentioned: Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. And given that the theory that the Garden of Rennes is mimicking the garden where Jesus' tomb was situated, well, we have a church to Magdalene, that's 1 Mary. We have a virgin statue in the garden, that's 2. And we have a grotto in the garden, which makes the 3rd Mary. We also have to remind that Mark 16:6 is the one that makes the message to Jesus is not here. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, but he is not here. But then he also, in the next one, says, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. You will see him there. So I'm bringing back the page of the document of the priest notes that Bijou left, seen here, right where he says over and over again, Jesus of Galilee is not buried here. And so I think that also could be tying in that somehow this particular Mark 16:1-8 is wanting to be referred to very carefully in the story of Rennes-le-Château. Supposedly this entire idea will connect to some very odd things that this same Bijou wrote in a notebook just before he fled to Spain. Anyway. Just so you know, he wrote that Jesus of Galilee is not buried here. He wrote it 12 times on the page, which of course is symbolic as well. And the number 12, I think, should be looked into more deeply into perhaps Mark 12, which I haven't done yet. Look into the entire chapter, Mark 12. About the June 21 date being used, another indication, and this comes from the official report of the installation and blessing in the church square, that's the feast day of St. Louis de Gonzague. Feast day of St. Louis de Gonzague, and it said it was to commemorate the first communion of the 24 children of the parish to bring to close the spiritual exercise of the retreat, right, like I mentioned. It ended with the statue being placed up and the photographer taking photos of it, and there was a number of priests there, including the Bishop of Carcassonne, in order to commemorate that day. Now, granted that, because it's listed in a report, but they spelled the name of Saint Louis de Gonzague wrong. It's supposed to be Saint Louis Gonzaga, but they've listed it as Saint Louis de Gonzague, and they also claim the Duke de Nevers, who's also mentioned in this painting, was listed as the 15th painting in this document. He was listed as the 15th Grand Master in the supposed Priory of Zion, and he was the successor of Robert Flood. And we go back again to the Calvet story of how Robert Flood and alchemy links to the story of how Calvet bought the very mansion where Flood was supposed to have hidden his manuscripts. So again, I hope you're seeing the tremendous connection of all of this stuff that's going into this particular story. Let's look at what else is in the garden. We have this, which is the Calvary Cross. And the Calvary Cross is also very unique because it of course centers exactly, if the garden is mirroring the church, then the church altar is exactly where this cross is. And Sauniere had this cross built and torn down twice before he finished it. So 3 times the cross was actually built. On top of the pedestal in Latin has the phrase, may Christ protect may Christ protect his people from all evil. Below it is a phrase, half of the phrase is in Latin, half of the phrase is in French. The Latin phrase says, on this cross, on the cross of salvation. The second part, the French part, says, love, welcome, and respect our cross. Right in front of it is he placed the nightstone, and the nightstone in the church was supposed to be, again, found right in front of the altar, covering the crypt, covering the entrance to the crypt, which he later sealed over with a new altar. But the nightstone is on the outside of in the exact same place, right in front of the Calvary Cross. So again, I hope you're seeing the strange mirrored clues, almost like that he's leaving in everything that he's doing. It's a very strange thing he set up. There's a couple of other very interesting things in this garden that I just want to mention quickly before we move on to the other things. One of which is what's known as the Wayside Altar. And the Wayside Altar is a small building that became Sauniere's office and library near the cemetery. And it's built in exactly the spot where something called a reposier should be. And in France, a reposier is a viewing room. It's a place where the dead could be viewed before the burial. For some reason, Sauniere got the council to let him, at his own expense, do everything he wanted in the garden where he went to build his grotto, to build his cross, and in the exact spot where the reposier is supposed to be, he built the office. This functioned as a second library. He had another library in the Tour Magdala. So he has this giant library built here, but oddly, he placed a giant cistern of water underneath the Wayside Altar. And the problem is that it's really far away from where anyone can collect water and put it in the cistern. It's not like it's a natural, it's a water collection area. So you have to collect the water and then bring it to the cistern. He also then placed a library in this very place where not only are they bringing water in, but also more importantly, that if there was some kind of fire in the area and the fire department needed to bring hoses in to attach to the cistern, there was high likelihood that all of his books would get destroyed from the water flying around out of the hoses. And there was a documented fire on July 14, 1895, and firemen tried to gain access, but so the story goes, Sauniere became enraged at their attempts to get his water. It made no sense at all unless, of course, A, the cistern under there is fake, and it's not really, there was no cistern and there was no water being collected at all, that it was some kind of giant misdirection, and if he'd let the firemen in, they would have found there was no water, or maybe even found there was no cistern at all. Is it perhaps, again, another way of blocking a passage that could be getting to the crypt? Because just the way when the underneath of Rennes Chateau has been described to me, that whole underground area is just filled with tunnels and small rooms, and that it's a giant underground area. So there wouldn't just be one, there would be a main entrance to the crypt, but this crypt area then must have been linked to many of the other tunnels, and Sauniere might have had this almost paranoia, this need to block off every possible entrance where anyone could get to the underground levels that linked somehow to the crypt. And that story would make some sort of possibility as to what he was doing. Also at the bottom of this Wayside Altar is a stone known as the 1738 stone. I haven't seen it myself. I'm just going by other people's research on it. But they claim at the lowest part of the building is a stone that has these two numbers. The 17 of the number appears to be much older, but the 38 seems to be much newer and much simpler done. My suggestion as to what this stone might be is what's known as a seeding stone. In ancient Egyptian temples, they used to do this all the time. When it was time to tear down a temple and build a new one, they would always keep a few certain stones from that first temple and then use those stones as seeds to rebuild the new temple. So you're taking, even though you don't have the old temple, you're taking symbolically the energy and the time of it into your new one. And there's an indication that what he did is he took a block with the number 17 on it. Again, maybe someone trying to relate to this January 17 date that runs through the story, and then added the number 38. And the question is, well, why? Again, as a year, 1738 doesn't, at least in our version of historical events, doesn't fit the story. I thought it could relate to a chapter and verse in the Bible, 1738. I didn't really find anything of real significance when I was doing that. Then I got the interest of, if you remember, we'll talk about upcoming Henry Boudet's, the priest at Rennes-les-Bains' book, the Chromelech book, which we'll look at in the next video. And I wondered, okay, what's on, because I have his book, I wonder what's on page 17, word 38. So I looked it up. And the word is tectosages. So that doesn't seem to help us either. We've got the Grotto of Mary Magdalene, which I believe is the place that Sauniere set up a second altar for himself after he was no longer allowed to preach in the church after his suspension in 1909, 1911. He just set up another altar for himself in the garden and kept running the services. Even though they had a new priest and they were running things in the church, he ran his own services in the garden. And I think it was in the grotto that he set up this altar. Now this grotto is dedicated to the Magdalene, and again you have to ask, what does the cave represent? And it's of course very similar to the altar painting, right? That he wanted, with the Magdalene in the cave and the crossed fingers and the skull and the acacia bush and whatnot. So it's I get the sense that the entire garden area is set up as a giant puzzle. And even the Andre Duzet, who I call runs a Paralos group, that's the way I call it. He studies the mystery with a focus on a town to the east called Paralos. He claimed from finding a particular model that he felt that Sauniere was using, that he was specifically recreating the burial place of Jesus in the entire church grounds. And I think, again, there's a message to this that we're going to come to later, that southern France is linked to this story directly. And so I don't think he's necessarily building, how would I call this? He's not reconstructing a place in the Middle East. He's reconstructing a place much closer to home. That's all the clue I'm going to give you for now. You'll have to watch the next 4 or 5 installments before we get to that part of what I've got to say. So let's move on and move around the church a little bit. So here we've got remember I mentioned earlier, this area that almost guaranteed was part of the original church and now became the presbytery, which is the place where a priest is supposed to live. Now, when Sauniere first got there, this building was in total disrepair. It was so bad that even though Marie Denarnaud had already started living with him and was doing his cooking and whatever things she was involved in doing with him, he was renting out a room somewhere in the town, and it took one of the first things he did in his restoration was to restore the presbytery so he could live there. The problem with it, again, is once he builds the famed Villa Bethania, like right next door, this beautiful luxury house that has fantastic bedrooms where he threw parties, he and Marie never lived there. And her, well, by the way, her family, it wasn't just Marie lived with them. Her mother and I believe her mother, her father, sisters, the whole family lived with him in the presbytery. So again, don't get this idea that it's just Sauniere and Marie. It's like the whole family. And you'll see when I get to the cemetery, it seems like the entire Denarnaud family is involved in either helping Sauniere or blocking the village in some way. You'll see some of the things I talk about in a few minutes. So it's not just her, the whole family's involved, and they continue to live in the presbytery. None of them moved to the Villa Bethania. And even after Sauniere dies, and Marie could have, like I mentioned, sold the place, moved, lived somewhere else on the property, she continues to live in the presbytery. So, when we look at the presbytery, it becomes very strange in itself. Now, on the surface, it makes sense that the priest lives right next door to the church, and not only does he live next door, there was a door, seemingly, between the church and the presbytery, at least there used to be, where you could just walk from one door, from the presbytery into the church directly, and you wouldn't have to go outside. Okay, that theoretically makes sense. It's no longer a presbytery, it's now the museum. And they have it sort of, they've tried to set up, this is where you'll find some of the relics, the pillars, the items, the stories, and they've tried to recreate parts of the presbytery to try to say this is how it looked in Sauniere's time. But even that turns out to be fake and false. There is a document that is around from a woman named Marie Boussent. Again, the Maries just show up everywhere in the story. And it discussed the layout of the presbytery at the time of Berenger Sauniere. And what's really odd is that in this document, the kitchen is on the right of the building, and on the left of the building is what's known as the commons area. However, when you go into the museum today and they have it set up, you'll notice that the kitchen is on the left, and something called the Grotto room is on the right. Now, it seems like a minor thing, but if this is a building that has been turned into a museum of Sauniere's story, why would you change the layout of the presbytery? And in fact, a whole new kitchen was built. It's not like they actually, of course, there was no kitchen there. They actually had to build a brand new kitchen for it. So I don't have the specific details. So, okay, was the kitchen built, say, by Noel Corbu in the 1950s, if for some reason when he took over the land, he didn't like where the kitchen was and he moved it and he's the one who built the new one? Or was this actually done by the museum? Because that would be really crazy for the museum to know the kitchen is here, we're going to move it to the other side and pretend like that's where the kitchen in this place was. So again, this Andre Duzet guy, he was the one who has done a really deep exploration of this presbytery. And he's made some interesting observations. Again, in the place that was the original kitchen, that is now this commons area, there might have been a passage that existed under a metal plate by the chimney. And this could be a direct entrance to the crypts or some underground location. But the floor in this room, that's a story, right? That there had been a passage there. The floor in this new room, which used to be the kitchen, has two kinds of flooring material. The main part is concrete. It's a concrete that sort of imitates wood. It's not real wood, it's a concrete. And he claims that when he walks on it, there's no echo. But the second part that's placed near the old fireplace, which is on the left when you're entering, it's made of real wood. And he says when he taps on that part of the wood, it makes an echoing sound. And he wonders, he said, okay, obviously a wooden floor will echo naturally a little bit more than a concrete floor because there's always a little bit of air beneath it. But first of all, why would you have two different kinds of flooring? Why wouldn't you just keep the same floor completely through the whole build? Why is one basically cemented in place? It's actually, it looks like wood, but it's cement. And why is the one area that's not cement a real wood that you could easily pull up if you needed to lift the wood up with just a little bit of prying tools? And it's an oddity that no one's been able to properly ask. In the place where the new kitchen is, where the hearth sits, it's on top of an iron cast plate, which itself sits on top of a stone that is slightly raised off the kitchen floor. And he's wondering if the stone that the hearth is on now is perhaps part of the original stone altar, the one that helped seal off the subterranean entrance. And if so, it would be like a clue that the hearth in the old presbytery was a link to the crypt below. You see this really strange, bizarre stuff here? The fact that the room is named Grotto is an indication that of Sauniere's best friend during the period, who was the priest of Bézu, just south of Rennes. And the Bézu church, which we'll also see later, has some very odd Templar-like symbols, including one made of fishes, out of fishes or rope, several statues of saints, including Joan of Arc. Grotto trained at St. Sulpice. He became the priest of Amélie-les-Bains in 1900 and the priest of St. Paul de Fenouillet in 1908. And it was to Grotto that Sauniere supposedly gave the most valuable item of Rennes at the time, a gold chalice that had been donated to the church by the Order of the Knights of Malta in 1750 and hidden by Bézu before he fled to France. Grotto died in 1946, but the place he was at, the St. Paul de Fenouillet, just near that is a small gorge that runs to Bug Arch. It's called Gorge du Galamus. And in the past there had been a gangrene epidemic. So some young men went to a cave, which is now known as the Cave of the Magdalene, to ask for help. And soon after, when the condition disappeared from the village, in thanks they built a small hermitage and chapel at the site. I'm just mentioning that because of the link to Grotto, and we'll look at that in a future video because that's also quite interesting. What else have we got in this area? Well, I mentioned the Villa Bethania. So here's the Villa Bethania. And this is one of the first main construction projects he built after the garden and after finishing the church. And again, it's linked to the town of Bethany, and that's where Lazarus was raised from the dead. And this is one of the stories that some claim that Sauniere was, because we'll see he was working in the cemetery late and theoretically digging up bodies. Some wondering if he was trying to do the same as Jesus, raising people from the dead, raising Lazarus from the dead. Now, of course, the Lazarus story in the Bible is not about Jesus. You have to read it very carefully, but it's not about Jesus making a dead person alive. The dead person in the story is the normal walking human, right? The zombie, the unawake, the uninitiated. And it's Jesus, through his teaching and his work and his help, helps Lazarus. Like, he doesn't awaken him, right? Lazarus, like it's always, you do the work yourself. Lazarus does the work in order to turn himself to an initiate. He becomes alive again, or he he gets his life back. So that's the story. That's the story. How Sauniere knows the story or how he relates the story, we don't know. The foundation stone for the villa was laid in June 1901, and the building was completed in May 1905. Again, as usual, L.A. Bott was one of the main constructors of almost everything Sauniere did. Along with the Tour Magdala and the purchase of the land, these two buildings cost 26,417 francs. That's a lot of money. And this is where all of the rich people who came to see him were housed and were entertained. There's some interesting things, though. On the front door are these two stained glass windows that each have a fiery heart inside a circle square type mandala. And these two fiery hearts link to a story of another vision of the Virgin Mary from the early 1800s, where the Virgin told the seer, this is Catherine Laboure, I have to look on the back, where she had two visions to her. One was to first tell her that the French throne would soon be overthrown, which it was 10 days later. And then she appeared a second time, surrounded by 12 stars. She carried a ball made of gold, and at her feet was a green snake and a half-white ball. And it was in this image, first of all, how alchemic of an image can you get? Like that's right out of an alchemic book from like the 1500s, right? But apparently she gave a message that these fiery hearts, if they would be made into metals, would protect the wearer. And so because of this image, or this vision, these medallions started to be produced in France. And in fact, it's claimed by 1876, 1 billion of them had supposedly been made and sold in France. So this is what Sauniere puts over the door, these famous fiery hearts from this vision. There's another heart, or just over the door is the Sacred Heart of Jesus statue, where he has his arms outstretched. So that means we've got a lot of sacred hearts before you even enter the building. Now you have to remember, this is a building of luxury, and again, why would you have such an incredible building built for yourself and not live in it? It's very, very strange. Here we have the Tour Magdala, and this is just opposite the cemetery, and this is a tower that some claim, not some, a woman named Patricia Chaplin, linked to Charlie Chaplin, who claims that this tower is linked to a tower in Girona in Spain as part of some sort of time travel experiments that she and her boyfriend were involved in. We'll get to that story later in another video, but I'm just mentioning it as you got to keep all possibilities open in the story, because none of us were there for any of this, and so no matter how crazy something seems, you've got to keep it on the table until you can for sure disprove it. But what we do know about the Tour Magdala is it's named after the Magdalene, right? And what's very interesting about the word Magdalene and the word Magdala is Magdala actually refers to tower. It refers to that word, and I think it's in Hebrew, is the name for tower. So you've almost got this thing named Tower. So, and also this idea of tower or strength that the Magdalene becomes linked to. What is the strength, or almost the pillar, you might say, which links us back to the pillar, the upside down pillar in the garden that we talked about, might in some way link to the Tour Magdala. It's exactly 22 steps to the top of the tower, and so we have to recall that July 22 is the feast day of the Magdalene. Sauniere had another library in the basement of this tower, and just across from it is another tower, but this one's covered in glass. It's known as the Orangery, and it was supposed to have been a place where Sauniere had his exotic plants. Sauniere had plans to build an even bigger tower. He wanted to build one that was 60 meters high. And he had just signed the contract work just before his death in 1917. There's also a story of this, what's being called a red dot, in the western corner of the flooring of the Tour Magdala, just before you go up the stairs, claiming to be some sort of, and I mean everybody's got a theory as to what this is referring to. Some just claim it's a mark in the floor. Others claim it's a specific message. I don't want to go too much into the Tour Magdala. It's got there are outstanding views of the valley. The way the windows have been crafted, or small openings have been crafted, have been claimed to give. Some have claimed give specific viewing points of astronomical events in the sky. Others of specific points in the landscape. Others of viewpoints to see certain aspects of what's happening in the landscape, because there are people who believe that the entire landscape around Rennes-le-Château is a gigantic labyrinth that gets walked, and that Sonia was using this to watch the processions in the labyrinth. No one has any idea, really, what this is for. And if you've got, I've looked hard to try to come up with something as to really what the Tour Magdala is really about. So if you've been studying this for a while and you've got some clues, I didn't want to take too much more time into it, but leave them in the comments, and we'll see if you can dig into what that is. Again, I'm going to talk about the connection with the Spain story in the next video. But if you've got something on the Tour Magdala, by all means, please leave it, and we'll get to it. The last thing I want to mention before we end this video is the cemetery, and the cemetery is also a very strange place. Again, this is suggested to have been the place where the tomb of Marie de Negre was found. But is it a real tomb? Is it a fake tomb covering an underground entrance? Is she relating to a tomb of the Magdalene? There had actually been a bit of a lot of digging going on there in the 1960s and 70s, but that might link to the digging that happened before that. There seems to be, after Sauniere had done some of the church renovations, or had just begun his church renovations, there's information that he spent a lot of his nights in the cemetery, digging. Moving tombs. Some have suggested he was digging up bodies, or that he was defacing certain tombstones. And there were a number of complaints. We do have some of the complaints still, the actual complaints still listed, demanding him to stop, which apparently he did. He did actually stop. Now, why did he stop? Maybe he was worried that further investigation into what he was doing would uncover something. Perhaps he was actually finished, so it didn't matter for him that he stopped. He had no need to continue. But the question is, why was he doing all this? And if the story is correct of him finding these parchments and him finding these clues and him understanding the gravestone, remember there were 5 other priests before Sauniere to preach at Rennes-le-Château. So why did none of them come across the parchments or the hints? Were they foolish? Was Sauniere lucky? Or was he the one that was chosen to have some sort of inside information? Because Sauniere seems to know, according to the story, exactly where to look, what to do in the altar, in the cemetery, in the church, in the presbytery. And then he goes about not only doing what he has to do to get his information, but then sealing it off and then laying clues about what he found. And in the cemetery is no mistake. He installed a solid iron gate. And again, we're back to the link here. It was the father of Marie de Narnaud who built the gate in the wall. In essence, he made the cemetery like a fortress. And he put his office right next to the entrance of it, as if he's going to be able to keep watch on everyone going in or out and everything that he's doing. So again, while this area is best known for the Villa Bethania and the Tour Magdala, all the additions in the church, you can't forget that he spent a tremendous amount of money to fence and wall off the cemetery. And again, this is the very place that he and Marie seem to be digging night after night, and no one knows what they were digging for. Is he digging up a sealed tomb? Is he digging up something else? No one has any idea. I'm going to skip that. There's also an unused space in the cemetery, and it's labeled as the Angel's Square. And it's the area where supposedly non-baptized children were supposed to be buried. The theory goes that generally these were children who would be stillborn or died just after birth, and as such they supposedly were not able to have their baptism, so they had to be buried in this very special area close to the church, so they would somehow get some sort of special blessing, so they would be able to make it to heaven, you know, the standard weird religious rules. But there are no clues at all that anybody has been buried at all in this area. There's no tombs, there's no flowers, and in one sense that's maybe understandable, but we can also observe that the area hasn't been used for a long time, and some could say, well, maybe there just are very few infants who die in childbirth now. No one seems to be, it doesn't seem to be need to be used, but it seems like it's been left completely untouched. And the location that was known as it's known in French. The Square of Angels is known in French as Limbes or Limbo, right? The state where the non-baptized people who were believed to be in after death, between heaven and hell. And here at Rennes-le-Château, it's located against the southern wall, a wall that was specifically constructed by Sauniere, and the wall that has the iron gate in it. So remember, a wall did not exist in this exact spot before Sauniere. And it would be one of the main reasons why the original Angel Square would not have been here. When you look into the documents, or others who've looked into the documents about the state of the cemetery at Sauniere's time, we find that the area did not exist at that location, but did exist against the wall of the church. Because that's where it's supposed to be, at the edge of the holy ground, right? So that the parents of the deceased infant were comforted that their link to heaven was not destroyed. But Sauniere seems to have had no interest in continuing this, and he moved this area very close to where his library was. And some of course claim that he was somehow some believe Sauniere was a black magician, and that a lot of what he was doing here was black magic, and that he wanted the souls of the dead bodies of these young innocent children in order to use in his rituals that he was holding in this area under his library. I'm not saying I agree with this stuff, right? I'm just sharing you the stuff that's in my research for you to think about. Anyway, one last cemetery oddity that we want to discuss is Sauniere's tomb himself. And again, I mentioned in a previous video that Sauniere had been buried in a very specific. It's not like he just had a grave and a gravestone. He actually has a tomb, right? All of the priests, or many of the priests of Rennes-le-Château, had actual tombs dug into the ground, like small little, smaller to medium square-like blocked structures. You can see this here is an entrance. It's not, this one isn't Sauniere's tomb. His is a little further in the back, but it looked very much like this. This was the original tomb. And he was buried, Marie d'Arnaud was also buried in that very same, we'll call it a crypt, because it's not a tomb, it's a crypt. And as you recall, in 2004, because so many people were trying to get in there, they took him out, dug him out, put him in a new grave, now not a tomb, put him in a grave, right, and put 5 tons of concrete over him. But here's some photos that exist. I don't remember which site I got these from, but these are a couple of photos from inside Sauniere's tomb from when they were doing the changeover, just to give you a look at what the original tomb he had been buried in. But what you see now is he's placed in this particular area. But there was there was an original headstone. Again, the headstone that's there now is not really the exact original headstone, but this is the original headstone that was there, with supposedly the face of Sauniere. But I think this was this Ben Hammett who was the one who was focused on this? He asked this question because to him, the face didn't look like Berenger Sauniere, but looked more like his brother Alfred. And if you see again here, here's the headstone, here's Sauniere, and now here's his brother Alfred, and now here's the tombstone again. So it's very interesting that this one could have some merit. Now his brother Alfred died in 1907, and is supposed to be buried in their hometown, but he's not he wasn't buried in the cemetery there either. He's another odd priest who winds up not being in the town cemetery. He's got a grave outside of the town. The excuse given for this is that he shamed his family by being an alcoholic. after Alfred's death, his children lived with Sauniere for a while. But even if it's by some fluke, the gravestone looks way too much like Alfred and not like Sauniere. Like when I look at this gravestone, I don't see Berenger Sauniere in it at all. And so, assuming that that's what happened, wouldn't some of the villagers have known right away? Because they would have met both of them. They would know who Alfred was and who Berenger Sauniere was. Certainly Marie would have known that's not Berenger Sauniere. She, lived with him, was potentially his lover for 20 plus years. She should know who that was. And then interestingly, again, another one of these strange stories. A decade or so ago, vandals came in and defaced this stone. In this case, they hacked out the eye and they hacked out the mouth. So again, it's this idea of heads of everything in this story seem to get attacked by vandals here. So again, if you're looking for treasure, if you think you're on a treasure hunt for some sort of gold, why would you try to knock off or deface the head of certain statues? You see, something is very, very strange with the whole story. Is there anything else I want to say about the garden at this point, or anything about Sauniere before I finish? Yeah, I'll finish with this last little piece. And that is, as you recall, the Bishop of Carcassonne was the one who was there for all of these inauguration ceremonies. He helped inaugurate the church, he inaugurated the statue in the garden, he inaugurated the garden itself. And he was very much a friend of Sauniere, so much so that one villager claimed that the bishop wasn't disappointed by Sauniere's actions at all. In fact, after the rededication service, the two of them were seen strolling in the church garden, deep in conversation, their arms around each other's shoulders, and they had exchanged hats. This is from KTS, Keeper. I can't remember the name. I have to put the title up below. But this is very odd. Why would the Bishop of Carcassonne allow Sauniere to wear his hat and for him to wear a priest's hat as they walk around? I'm pretty knowledgeable of the religious dogma and order in these things, and you wouldn't want to let a lower class, you might say, of the hierarchy wear your hat. There's also supposedly a photo on Sauniere's deathbed, but on the table beside his and I'm going to look for the photo, see if I can find it and put it up. Supposedly there's not a priest's hat on the table next to him, but a bishop's hat. So the question ends here, is somehow Sauniere seen as a bishop? And maybe not as a high-ranking bishop in the Christian Catholic tradition. Is he perhaps the bishop of some other deeper organization? Is he the bishop or is he a leader of something else, some other secret society of which all of these priests of the valley were a part of? And that may link to that very odd taking of the red tassel ceremony from his death. That somehow he is representative of some other secret society. And that's what we're going to start moving into next, the valley. We'll be looking into next Henry Boudet and the strange book and the strange church at Rennes le Bain. We're going to be looking at Priest Tacoma, the one who had all of his altars in the valley that he built, blown up by dynamite in the 1950s. We're going to be looking at the Black Madonna and the crypts of Notre Dame de Marciel. We're going to be looking at the mountains like Bug Arch and Cardew and Mount Segur, and some of their relations potentially to New Testament stories specifically. We'll be looking at various paintings in other churches, various statues in other churches. We're going to be looking at strange monuments. We're going to be looking at the landscape. We're going to be looking at the geometry of the landscape. So the next video, lots to come. Thanks for taking some time to sit here and listen to the next part of the story. And hopefully there's something for you to consider, talk about, think about. Because like I say, I look now at the Et in Arcadia Ego painting by Poussin, both of them, with completely new eyes. One little extra piece of information has turned the paintings completely around. And everything in the story, I think, can happen like that. One little piece of information can turn the whole story around. You're looking at the story this way, or it looks like it's going this direction, then all of a sudden, boom, the story can turn, and it can take us all into much deeper things. Because I feel what I'm sharing here is a story and a journey for all of us to come to terms with, does something in this story, does something in this mystery relate to each of us and the challenges we're going through right now, as realistically the whole world is changing, the whole world is transforming, and not in a very good way. And is something in this story a way for us to keep something good and positive through the transition? See you in a few days with another video.